So, one of the big questions I often get asked by parents, students, and friends is, isn't the CPU meant to be the thing deciding the speed of the computer? And yes, it does. But there's a few other little problems. And so, we're going to look today at why does storage affect speed? So, CPU speeds are the number of calculations that a computer can do in a second. But what happens if the CPU is waiting for more information to do a calculation? That's right, nothing, because it's got nothing to go on. So let's start to have a look at that in a little bit more detail and see what could be holding back your CPU from its full potential. And to do this, we're going to look at how they designed the PlayStation 5 and what they did to improve on the PlayStation 4. It's a perfect case study for this scenario. So, this is a good old-fashioned hard disk drive. Okay, this is the one where it junk, junk, junk. And it had a read speed of about 50 megabytes to 100 megabytes and a seek time of 2 to 50 milliseconds. So that means if all of the data is in one convenient place, it could read 1 gigabyte in about 10 seconds. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the way it works. If that data was compressed, the PS4 calculations were fast enough to compress on the flight. You could get it down to 6.7 seconds. And newer games have been taking full advantage of all this technology. So that's great. And that shows the power of the PS4. And for its time, it was brilliant. But that's not great today, eh? And unfortunately, often this stuff isn't streamed. So that means you could be searching all over the hard drive and you could end up with about 20 seconds to get just 1 gig of data. So, firstly, that's a good old-fashioned hard disk drive. So 20 to 50 millisecond seek time. Every time you need to find a bit of data that isn't in one area. Now we're looking at SSD. You ready to see the speed difference? It is nearly instantaneous. In fact, it's so fast that we really haven't got any way of measuring it because there is almost no slowdown whatsoever. So if we look at the hard disk drive speed of the 1 gig, we remember 20 seconds. Okay, so that's it. That was hoping. And we now see that the seek time has gone to instantaneous. The bandwidth, the speed which it can read things, has gone up to 5 gigabytes a second. We reckon that's the minimum for the PS5. So that is what they did. And now look at the difference here. That has reduced things down to 0.27 seconds. That means that not just 1 gig, but 2 gigs of data can be loaded in a quarter of a second. That's like the time it's taking me to fade between these presentations. That means fast travel will actually mean fast travel. So that's one important factor of the storage, is that. And the next one is RAM. I'm going to have a little look at that in a little bit more detail now.
Like us, computers have short-term memory for immediate tasks and long-term memory for more permanent storage. When you run a program, your operating system allocates area within the short-term memory for performing those instructions. For example, when you press a key in a word processor, the CPU will access one of these locations to retrieve bits of data. It could also modify them or create new ones. The time this takes is known as the memory's latency. And because program instructions must be processed quickly and continuously, all locations within the short-term memory can be accessed in any order, hence the name random access memory. The most common type of RAM is dynamic RAM, or DRAM. There, each memory cell consists of a tiny transistor and a capacitor that store electrical charges, a 0 when there's no charge, or a 1 when charged. Such memory is called dynamic because it only holds charges briefly before they leak away, requiring periodic recharging to retain data. But even its low latency of 100 nanoseconds is too long for modern CPUs. So there's also a small, high-speed internal memory cache made from static RAM. That's usually made up of 6 interlocked transistors, which don't need refreshing. SRAM is the fastest memory in a computer system, but also the most expensive, and takes up 3 times more space than DRAM.
So, what was happening on the PS4? Well, they had 8 gigabytes of GDDR RAM, which is really nice. But the problem was, they had to think about loading the next 30 seconds of gameplay because the hard drive was so distant and difficult to use. So that caused a lot of problems, and it meant that things are slow. Now let's have a look at the next lot. So now we've got 16 gigs, but because of the SSD, it's getting to it much, much faster. What 2 storage devices must you ensure have enough space? Firstly, you've got to make sure you have enough RAM. And secondly, you've got to make sure either in a computer that all of the programs have enough space to run comfortably in RAM, in which case, actually, your hard disk drive might not matter too much if everything's loaded. It might only affect boot speed. So for example, an SSD takes 20 to 30 seconds to boot, whereas my old machine took 3 minutes to boot. But once it was booted, it was actually quite fast and most day-to-day tasks were fine. Remember, HDD, the old-fashioned hard drives, are much, much slower, but they come in much bigger capacities. Some people choose to have a nice 256 gig SSD and then like a 1 or 2 or even a 4 terabyte hard drive that might be removable. Thank you very much for listening.